Welcome back to another video. This video is a huge one because I'm literally talking about the best books I've ever read. And also two, a weird one because I've decided to sit on the floor for this one, which is not a normal thing that I do usually. I've seen other people do it, so I thought, okay, I'm gonna sit on the floor for a bit, see if that brings in all the views. I don't know. But yeah, so I have read, I don't know, hundreds of books at this point. I started reading properly again when I was in my mid-20s, early 20s. Came back from uni and basically decided during the summer I was gonna pick up a book. I think it was The Girl on the Train. And then basically that snowballed my reading. Not The Girl on the Train was so good, I was like, oh my God, I'm back into reading now. It just snowballed my reading to a point where I was like, I now love reading again. Found audiobooks, got an Audible subscription, found out Kindle, started picking up Kindle books, was reading on trains, etc. So then what I started to do is I started to realize I bloody love reading. I'm going to start thinking about which of my books are my favorite reads of all time. Therefore, I've spent the past half an hour or so picking from my bookshelf my favorite books of all time. This is a really hard thing to ever do because at the time that you think the book is one of your favorite books of all time, you may look at it back at it now and think, no, it's not as good as it was back then, or I've read much better books then. I may have said in a review back then when I wrote the review of it saying, oh my God, it's amazing. It's one of the best books I've ever read. It's definitely going to feature in my all-time books I've ever read, blah, blah, blah. And then I come to it now and I look at it back and I think, is it now as good as it was when I read it then? I don't know. But either way, I've got a list of books here. You can probably see the top one there, so you probably had a little bit of a spoiler there. That's not one. This is just an empty part of my bookshelf that I've not yet read. I have a very big bookshelf over there full of books that I've not yet read. This is not an empty part of my bookshelf that I've not read. This is an empty part of my bookshelf that I've not yet filled. I do have a pile of large books over there that I've not yet read, which is hopefully going to start filling up this area over the next few months. Let's get into it. That's a long intro. Let's find out what my favourite books of all time are. So these are going to go in absolutely no order whatsoever. I feel like I need to move this because you're going to see what the next book is every time. But the first book we're going to talk about is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, I went on a bit of a Taylor Jenkins Reid binge last year. Binge read? Read binge? Which way do you say that? I don't know. I did that and ended up reading this. I ended up reading Daisy Jones and the Six. Carrie Soto is back. And then there was one other I think I read, possibly not, possibly only those three. No, there was one about the summer. There was one about, I can't remember the name of it. It's up there. But anyway, Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is probably my favourite of them. Maybe other than Daisy Jones and the Six. But I thought I'd only pull out one Taylor Jenkins Reid for this list. Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo follows the story of Evelyn Hugo. She is essentially pulled up for a report, kind of at the end of her career. Somebody wants to do an exclusive interview with her and there's only one person she'll do it with and we're like, we don't know why, blah, blah, blah. But then what ends up happening is she recalls her kind of story from Los Angeles in the 1950s through to show business in the 80s. It says here on the back, I'm just reminding myself, I read this a while ago. Along the way, she obviously has 7 husbands and it talks about why she has 7 husbands. A lot of them aren't necessarily, I'm so in love, I'm not in love anymore, let's divorce, blah, blah. Some of them are convenient, some of them are for image, etc., etc. And it's a really, really powerful story. The thing that Taylor Jenkins Reid does so well is she manages to essentially get these life-spanning stories into one book. And it's so fascinating to read. You genuinely feel like you've read a lifetime. You've read the journey of somebody who's been through a lot of different experiences. And somebody in show business, and a lot of Taylor Jenkins Reid's her books are about people who have massive lives, who have incredibly large, outgoing, public lives, and what it's like behind the scenes. And that's what it was like for Evelyn Hugo in The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. She's essentially a massive film and TV star who's one of the greatest that's ever lived. And he's kind of like in the twilight of her years, and she's then doing this interview to talk about it. And there is some kind of other reasons she's doing the interview as well, which you find out later on. But it's just a lovely, lovely, fantastic book. One that's really, really impressed me and is probably the pinnacle of Taylor Jenkins books at the moment. I would say, as I said, Daisy Jones and the Six is probably also up there. These are probably top 2 tier, but I think this one's slightly more known. Though Daisy Jones and the Six does now have a TV series out, so maybe not. I do think this has some sort of rights to become a TV or whatever. We'll see. Either way, this is the first book on my list of the best books I've ever read. Next, we're going big. It's Lord of the Rings. Now, I've got one of the books. I've got the other books, but I don't have them as one collection. I have them separated into 3 individual books. So this is The Return of the King, the final one in the series. Now, Lord of the Rings is always talked about when you talk about fantasy. In fact, I've got a couple of fantasy books in here. The series is always talked about when it comes to fantasy because it just is epic. There is, without a doubt, a precedent that has been set with the Lord of the Rings series. Not only did it make fantasy mainstream, not only did the films then throw it even further into mainstream, pretty much every fantasy, not every fantasy, sorry, but so much fantasy these days has influence from Lord of the Rings. So many things were created in Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, so many cultures, so many species, so many races, or expanded upon to a point where they actually had conversations and histories and lives and things like this that are now just part of fantasy books, part of your high fantasy. And I think that goes underestimated. Now, nobody here is going to underrate Lord of the Rings. You may have enjoyed it, you may have never read it, you may not get what the hype is, but you've got to appreciate what it's done. Yes, there's been some fairly poor portrayals recently in TV shows and games and things like this, but the books themselves are brilliant. And what's even more impressive is, yes, there's some elements of some of the books that these days they would cut out. Like there's literally multiple pages of songs and conversations and things that these days the editor would be like, you need to cut this down, that weren't cut down. But there's also an element of that that adds to the culture. Like I absolutely adore, I don't know, listening or reading these songs or having these deep conversations. Sometimes, yeah, I do wish they're a bit shorter, but you can see the way that time has changed with fantasy books there. And there maybe if anyone's going to consider it the weakest parts, but you've got fantastic people in here. I mean, Frodo's dull, but he's dull in the movies and he's dull in the book, so we all know that. But everybody else is great. Samwise Gamgee is amazing. Gandalf is amazing. The orcs are some of the most recognizable evil creatures in cinema. You show them show somebody a picture of that from the films and people are like, I know that. And they kind of defined what an orc kind of looks like as well. And it's just fantastic. It really, really set the bar for fantasy so high, so early on, that every other fantasy is kind of living up to it. And you've got diverse fantasy books now. You've got loads of different ways of doing fantasy. Some aren't, I don't know, elves, goblins, orcs, wild races. They're more fantastical, historical cities and more about your kings and your queens. And that's not what this is about at all. And that's absolutely fine. But this is, without a doubt, one of the best high fantasy series / books you will ever read. And I finished this last year. And I sat there and I finished it and I thought, yeah, it is that good. It isn't overhyped. It's not one of those books that's been lost in time that maybe was great years ago and you've got old people recommending it, saying it was so great when I was young. No, read this now if you're a fantasy fan and you'll still absolutely adore it. So it's the second book on my list, Lord of the Rings, all of it. Not just this one, the whole freaking series. Amazing. It's not a series, it's a book, I understand, depending on how old you are, what you understand. Amazing. Now, this may be a lesser known one for you. Janice Hallett is an author that I found a couple of years ago. So I randomly picked up her first book, The Appeal, which I would have here if, again, I hadn't lent that to somebody. So I've picked up another of hers, equally fantastic. Janice Hallett has a really unique way of writing her stories. I picked up The Appeal because I saw on Amazon that essentially it was a book told in the form of emails and texts and pamphlets and things like this purely. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. I wonder if it's any good. It was phenomenal. Using this media platform, using this way that she's written these books, she is able to get more kind of personality into every individual character because you can see how they write an email. You can see how they speak to different people a lot easier, how their kind of email personality changes depending on who they're talking to and in what situation. And that's something you really can't get across often in speech and things like this. So that's a massive bonus. So this one in particular is The Alperton Angels, which is her most recent full book. She's got another one coming out soon, which I think is called like The Assignment or something, which I will 1,000,000% be getting. The Alperton Angel specifically focuses on a true crime author, Amanda Bailey, who goes off and so she kind of picks up this story of a cult that happened years ago and some children went missing from a house, and it just tells a story of her trying to find it out, her getting a little bit too involved, and things starting to get a little bit scary, and it's all told via the medium of email and texts and what else have we got in here, pamphlets and all sorts of stuff. I mean, there's emojis in here. It's fantastic. It really, really is fantastic. It's not something where you think, oh, I can't really follow it. It's done so brilliantly well. Really, really impressed by Janice Hallett's kind of modern take on literature here. And as I said, so you've got The Appeal, which is the first one, which just follows a group of theatre owners and play people in a play. One day, the owner essentially of the theatre or the play group sends out an email saying that their child is incredibly unwell. They need to raise some funds for this child. Things start to get a bit suspicious. There's a murder, etc. It's all very, very dark. You've then got the Twyford Code, which is set in, God knows where it's set, but essentially about a man who gets obsessed with this code that he finds and obsessed with this idea that there's something more going on within this code that he's found. And then there's the Alperton Angels, and I've just described what this one's all about. But it's the way that she writes them is just fantastic. It's so clever. So without rambling on too much more, this is Janice Hallett's Alperton Angels. The third book, though, I'm kind of classifying all of Janice Hallett's books here in this series, with The Appeal being where you should start. It's just a bit shorter, it's a bit easier to get into maybe. But this is the peak. This is kind of like the top of the mountain. We'll see if The Examiner's as good as well next time. But yeah, so that's my third book. So we're back on the fantasy, and we're back into the realm of some of the GOATs. Greatest of all time, and we're talking Brandon Sanderson. Now, if you have read any fantasy, you've likely heard of Brandon Sanderson. People love his writing because it's so open, so easy to read, yet so creative, so interesting, so expressive. Essentially, what we've got with The Way of Kings is this is what you would probably consider his magnus opus. The other reason that Brandon Sanderson's so popular is he just pops out books at a rate of knots. If he was a mother giving birth, he would have been destroyed by now. That's a dark joke. Please don't ban me, YouTube. But he essentially pops out books so quickly that it's actually unbelievable. I'm not even sure how he types that quickly, let alone gets them like edited and published. But anyway, The Way of the Kings is the first book in the Stormlight Archive series. So this tells the story of a group of people in a world where it's called Roshar, a world of stones and storms. And it's really hard to describe this. So essentially we've got there are things called shard plates, there are things called shard blades. They cause people to become nearly invincible human beings. There you have a couple of people who have powers that are quite dangerous powers, and it scares other people. There's an overarching political thing going on. There's a war that's potentially coming. It's a very, very difficult one to describe mainly because I've not read it for a long time, so I can't quite remember the names of the characters and things. I remember one of them was called Kaladin, and I think we have a female later on as well. But it doesn't tell you on the back, which is very, very difficult to help with. But it's so, so, so good. And the thing that I love about Brandon Sanderson's writing, and specifically the Stormlight Archive, is what you're looking at right now, by the way, if you're wondering, is The Way of Kings, which is the first book in the series. There is a part 1 and a part 2 of this first book because they're so long. I think if you get in America, that's not the case. At the end of each book, so not this one, but the end of part 2 in this, there's always kind of like this massive, you've been reading about this thing that's quite down to earth. I mean, it's fancy, so it's not, because you're talking about like creatures you've never heard of and powers and things like this. But in terms of like things that kind of tangible, then you kind of get these little things that pop up every now and then, these people you meet, these characters that you kind of get involved with, or they meet along the way, that kind of break the fourth wall with this almost. They're there and they're like, there's something bigger going on. There's something greater. There's a universe out there. And you think, holy crap, okay, now I'm utterly invested. And that's Brandon Sanderson's specialty, is this ability, as I said, to say, you've been reading about this thing for like 95% of the book and you've thoroughly enjoyed it. There's so much more in the last 5%. There's a much bigger thing coming. You're probably going to read more about it in the next book. It's just brilliant. It really, really is brilliant. I feel a bit annoyed that I can't explain the Stormlight Archive more. As I said, I've not finished reading this yet. I know he's got a new one coming out and I need to read Rhythm of War. The last one I read was Oathbringer, and I'm talking probably 2, if not 3 years ago I read that. Way of the Kings is first. Get reading it. Brandon Sanderson is incredible. His writing is so engaging. I'm so excited to pick up the Rhythm of War at some point again. And then his new books, which I can't remember what they're called, or his new book, which I'm not sure what it's called. But that's The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, one of my favourite books of all time and from one of my favourite fantasy authors of all time. I often tell people that Brandon Sanderson is my favourite author, but we'll see. It might be somebody else on this list. So the next book is Us Against You by Fredrik Backman. Now, this is another book where it's not the book I'm specifically talking about, it's more about the author. I would say The Man Called Uwe by Fredrik Backman might be one of my favourite books of all time, but Fredrik Backman's writing in general is what keeps me engaged with all of it, and Us Against You is the second book in the Beartown trilogy. So specifically, this focuses around a little place called, I think it's called Beartown, where it's all focused around ice hockey, and there's loads of different characters, there's loads of different people involved, they're all going through their own little things, their own little family and personal stories, growing up, all this sort of stuff. But ice hockey is what everything focuses around, and how successful the ice hockey team is basically how happy the town ends up being. But what makes Fredrik Backman's writing so special is his ability to pull on your heartstrings one moment and bring in humour the next, and make everything feel light at the same time. There's a lot of metaphors in here, there's a lot of clever writing in here, but it's just also at the same time you feel like you're on such a human journey with it. And this trilogy, I think at the moment, is probably some of his best work. As I said, The Man Called Uwe was the first book that introduced me to Fredrik Backman, where I ended up feeling emotionally destroyed about a random old grumpy man. Really impressive. But as I said, this is the second in the Beartown trilogy. I've not finished the Beartown trilogy yet. Have you got an idea that I really struggle to finish things? But this is the second book, and it's just utterly fantastic. I can see a review on the back here from the Sunday Times. It says, a mature, compassionate novel, which I think is a fantastic way of describing Fredrik Backman's writing in general. And I would say Fredrik Backman is one of those that I just mentioned authors where if people say who's somebody I should definitely, just all of their books are banging, I would say Fredrik Backman is just absolutely fantastic. I don't think I've heard anybody speak negatively about Fredrik Backman's writing. So, and any books that he's read, I think everybody's like, this brilliant. It really is fantastic. So if you've not read any Fredrik Backman, yeah, I've said Fredrik Backman a lot. If you're not drinking every time I say Backman, you should be. And if you were, you're probably drunk. So that's fine. As I said, Us Against You is the second in the trilogy. And it continues the story of people in Beartown after an event happened in the first book that was horrible. And it all escalates. And in the second book, essentially the town is broken into two, divided by those that support the ice hockey, those that are against the ice hockey. There was a star that was basically disgraced in the first book, etc. I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's brilliant. It's fantastic. If you've not yet read any Fredrik Backman, this is my plea for you as a reader to go out and do that now, because he's utterly fantastic. Right, so I've moved that pile now because you can see all of them, but The Heart's Invisible Furies is the next book. So these next couple ones are going to be a couple of more modern books in terms of ones that you may have seen on my channel in literally the last few videos. The Heart's Invisible Furies, I feel like I've battered on about now for so long. Banged on about, not battered on. You don't batter on about a book. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. It's about, I say brilliant and fantastic a lot too. Anyway, I'm being very self-aware. John Boyne wrote The Heart's Invisible Furies, and he wrote it about a chap called Cyril, who grows up in 1960s Dublin. He is a child of Catherine Goggin, so I think his name's Cyril Goggin, but he never knows that because he becomes an orphan, goes and gets fostered, lives with his adopted parents, and lives up in Dublin. Now, the big thing about Cyril is he's gay, and you really cannot be gay in 1960s Dublin. Not only is, I think it's technically illegal, but also you get beaten, you get slapped on, it's seen as disgraceful and dirty and horrible, and Cyril has to grow up in a world where the very essence of who he is, just something incredibly natural, is frowned upon, and he has to hide it, and he has to pretend in other different ways as he grows older, how to kind of be as a person. Things do get easier as he gets older, as obviously people matured, politics changed, more sensible people came into power, this sort of thing. And things do get easier, but along the way, it's very dark. It's very horrible. There's moments in this book that will make you like, oh my God, that's so depressing, and that's fine. But there's also a lot of comedy in here, a lot of humor, a lot of light moments, a lot of genuine, deep human stories. The characters in here are utterly fantastic. Cyril himself, despite being the main character, and I tell people quite often that the main character in books sometimes can be very dull because they're just there to serve as a vessel through the story almost, so the author forgets to kind of write them into being a great person. But no, Cyril's brilliant. A load of people he meets along the way are brilliant. It's just amazing. It's really one of those books you just want to like cradle because it's just so heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. People have been recently asking me a lot over on TikTok Live and things like this what my favourite book is at the moment, and I'm having to say this because it just has been my favourite book of the year so far, which obviously then throws it onto this list of the best books I've ever read. It's written beautifully as well. It's almost poetic at times. It's just fantastic. If you've not yet read The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne, again, same as Fredrik Backman, I would plea you to go and do this now. Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. Pow! Following on from the whole things are emotional, things are fantastic, human beings can make you cry, One Day by David Nichols. Now, this all started because on Netflix, randomly, my partner put on the new TV TV show that came up earlier this year. And it said at the start based on the book, and Bron was like, have you ever read this? And I said, no, I've not ever read this. So I ordered the book straight away and said, don't let me see any of the TV series. I want to listen to the book. And what a journey it was. If you've not read One Day by David Nichols, it tells the story of Emma and Dexter, who meet at a graduation in 1988 and essentially grow up, but not really together. They form a friendship and a love that I think is deeper than any relationship they then go on to form as well. Dexter, throughout his whole life, is quite troubling. He's quite difficult. He struggles with addictions and publicity and the desire to be wanted and needed and be seen. And Emma is far more kind of mature, far more intelligent, has a much more mundane life in her life. If anything, is a little too boring, and they mix, and it's fantastic when they mix. And it's heartbreaking when things go wrong. And it's just a book that, again, took me so long to get over. There's a scene, and if you've read it, you know which scene I mean, towards the end, that literally shook me. I read it and flipped it back and thought, oh God, yes, that's happened. And it was really, really, really difficult to read. But such a fantastic, true portrayal of love as well. You hear about romance in so many books. You hear about how one person finds it so hard to love the other person because they're so good looking. I can't be dealing with that. I want two people that deeply, profoundly enjoy each other's company, don't really know it, don't really know why, but are exploring why. And it's just, One Day is just amazing. Really, really fantastic. One of the other books on this list that I read this year that has jumped up into my favourite books of all time. That's One Day by David Nichols. Now we're into the two proper classics on this list. So one of my biggest problems when people talk to me about what's your favourite book of all time, they expected me to say some profound book that changed my life. I can't go that far, but I can name two classics that I think I can understand why they've stood the test of time. And if people ask me what my two favourite books of all time are, these next two are that. So as you can see, this is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I remember very vividly reading this whilst on holiday somewhere in the centre of England, somewhere, some countryside, some hilly place with my partner. And it was just an absolute experience. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is about Scout, who is a young girl who is just growing up. Her father is a lawyer in town. One day, her father gets involved in a case where a black man is accused of raping, I believe, a young white girl. Fairly obvious from the outset, he's not guilty, but because he's black, because it is the 1930s in the deep south of America, it's pretty solid that he's going to get accused of rape because that's how racism worked back in the 1930s, deep South America. What ensues is essentially Scout learning lessons about morality, learning about life. Her father, Atticus Finch, is the ideal human being. Sometimes I did feel it was a little bit too morally perfect. For example, there was times where he literally never lost his temper when he should have lost his temper, and he explains why he didn't lose his temper. But it does create for a fantastic story where you've got Scout essentially just learning about life, and Atticus there to tell her what she should and shouldn't do. She's a little bit rebellious, she's a little bit tomboyish, she's a little bit kind of out there with how she is as a person. And so him being there to kind of guide her as an only parent is fantastic and interesting to see. And it really, really was brilliant to read about. And I think it's a classic because it's just kind of a simple premise. All you've got is a dad teaching his daughter the morals of life. Yes, there's other things that go on in the book. There's some other stories that go on, teach you things, that sort of stuff. But Atticus Finch is just a fantastic man, and there's some really powerful scenes in the book that were translated fantastically over to the film as well. And it lives with me for so long, and it's not too long as well. If you're somebody that doesn't enjoy a long read, it's not too long of a read. What are we looking at? I think we're looking at literally just over 300 pages. So if you're looking for something that you may think is just a really fantastic book that doesn't take you days upon weeks to read, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is one of the best books I've ever read. I think it will always be one of the best books I've ever read. I think it will go on forever in my list of, that's probably one of the best books I've ever read. What's most impressive, I think, about To Kill a Mockingbird is Harper Lee only ever wrote 2 books. She wrote this, and then I think she wrote a sequel to it, and the sequel was kind of meh. Imagine only ever writing 2 books, and the one book that basically sold the most is considered one of the greatest novels of all time. Amazing. So that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, a fantastic, fantastic classic novel. But what is my favourite book of all time? Let's find out. Now, I said that like I've been doing these in order. They've not been in order. I think these last two are probably my top 2 favourite of all time, but the others were just in a random order. One Day is not my 3rd most favourite book of all time, but East of Eden by John Steinbeck is my favourite book of all time. It's very, very hard when I say that out loud to go ahead and actually say it, because it's so difficult for me to categorically say, yes, that's the greatest thing I've ever read. But East of Eden by John Steinbeck is that. If I had to have a tick list of things that I need in a book, it covers all of those. It's emotional, it has fantastic characters, it covers decades or years of people's life. It's set in a place that is so far away from my existence, I would never understand it. It has characters you hate, has characters you love. It tells moral stories. It's written in a way where you're like, that was stunning. You could pull quotes from this in almost every other page. John Steinbeck is famous for being one of the greatest writers that's ever lived. And I think, in my opinion, East of Eden is probably his greatest piece of work. It is long. This may not look that thick, but the writing in here is very small and very close to the edges. It's not a small book. We're looking at over 500 pages here. Very thin pages, very small writing. But it is so worth it. You feel like you've been on one of the greatest journeys you will ever read. Let me kind of give you an idea about what this is about. Set in the rich farmland of California's Salinas Valley, or Salinas Valley, this sprawling and often brutal novel follows the intertwined destinies of 2 families, the Trasks and the Hamiltons, whose generations helplessly reenact the fall of Adam and Eve, and the poisonous rivalry of Cain and Abel. Here is a work in which Steinbeck created his most mesmerizing characters and explored his most enduring themes, the mystery of identity, the inexplicability of love, and the murderous consequences of love's absence. It's amazing. It really, really is. I don't know how else to describe it. I've used every word to describe books in this video so far. I've said brilliant, I've said excellent, I've said amazing, I've said fantastic. Did I say that one already? I don't know. This really is the epitome of one of the greatest books of all time. As I said, it ticks every box I need ticking in a book. Could it have been a bit shorter? Maybe. But did I feel like at the end it was a slog? No. It just had everything. I just feel like I'd been on a fantastically long journey, and I wanted to jump straight back into it again. I've not yet read any other John Steinbeck since, because I'm worried that it's not going to be as good as The East of Eden. I've not yet read many other classics yet, because I've read the likes of The Great Gatsby and things like this, and they just didn't sit with me quite like this sat with me. It really, really is fantastic. The East of Eden by John Steinbeck is my favourite book of all time. It's on this list. It will probably stay at the top for a very, very long time. My issue, as I said at the start or a little bit earlier on, is sometimes I feel like I can't have a modern book at the top of this list because not enough people will be like, oh my God, you can't call a modern book better than this, but it really, really is fantastic. So we need to talk about some of the honourable mentions that didn't get into this video. And there are some that I would consider massive influences on my reading that I don't think quite reached the level of the best books I've ever read. Okay, so there are 3 that I've picked out that I think didn't quite make this list, but could have easily slipped in. And if it was a different day, if I'd eaten a different breakfast, or if I'd breathed different air today, they would have been in there. So the first one is Harry Potter. Specifically The Goblet of Fire. I think the Harry Potter series is, I don't need to talk about it. Literally nobody needs to explain the Harry Potter series to anybody on YouTube or any place ever. It's fantastic. It was one of the first series I've ever started reading. It, for me, was a massive influence into my reading, into enjoying reading when I was young. The Harry Potter series was the biggest thing that's ever and will ever happen to books, without a doubt. To the fantasy genre specifically. I think a lot of people don't realise they're reading fantasy when they read Harry Potter because of the stories of children and the stories of kind of grown-ups, and how the books from the start of the book with the Philosopher's Stone right through to the final book grew up with us as we grew up with the books. It's just brilliant. And The Goblet of Fire is my favourite of the series. I think it's most people's favourites. It's just epic. It's got everything. It's got the competition. It's got the return of Voldemort. Spoiler alert if you've not read Harry Potter, by the way. Everything that you could do, the big deaths. It was basically, it's the turning, it's the catalyst for the actual, when Harry Potter actually kicks in. Now, I know there's some big moments in the previous books, but for me, this is the book where I was like, okay, now it's getting serious. So Goblet of Fire is a book on my list of other books I could have put on this list. One book I always think of, or one series I always think of when I think of the best books I've ever read, is the C.J. Samson Shardlake series. This is Dark Fire, which is the second book in the series, but it's about Matthew Shardlake, who is a hunchback in the 1500s, early mid-1500s, around the time of Henry VIII. And it just tells the story of Matthew Shardlake going around and solving crimes, but things are quite big, so he works with like the government and things like this. And so the crimes he is solving are essentially making sure that the country doesn't go into war and the right people stay in power and things like this. and it's wonderfully written. I wanted to mention it because one, it's fantastic, but also CJ Samson recently passed away just before the Shard Lake series on TV was made. I don't think, unfortunately, the Shard Lake series is particularly good. I've not watched it myself, but I've not seen a lot of hype around it, and I don't think it was reviewed fantastically. But the books are really, really good. They're full of character. They're full of like fast-paced action. They're full of world building. It's unbelievable that it almost feels like CJ Samson was around in the 1500s to be able to write these. Really, really good if you're a history nut. If you're not a history nut, it'll help you because it'll kind of immerse you into this world that you maybe didn't know existed in the 1500s, about how everybody was incredibly religious, how religion ran the country, etc. So really, really good. Would highly, highly recommend. And then the final book is a recent read I had, which is Lonesome Dove. And I did consider putting this in this list because it was just amazing. Really, really was. But I just kept looking at the other books and thinking, yeah, but I didn't love it quite as much as them, so it didn't feature. But Lonesome Dove is brilliant. If you've not heard of it, I think a lot more people have heard of it than I had heard of it, if that makes no sense at all. It's about a group of people, Augustus McCrae and W.F. Cole specifically, but also a group of people who go from Rio Grande to the highlands of Montana, and it just tells a story of their journey, both physically but also as people. There are young people in this that grow up. There are old people that learn to stop being so grumpy and horrible to everybody. There is love in this. There is betrayal. There's abandonment. There's heartbreak. It's brilliant. Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry is a book that for the first 500 pages I didn't rate too much. I think it was that fantastic. But quite shortly into, I think, the like 200-300 page mark, it's about 300 pages in, things started to kick off. Characters were getting really, really interesting and deep. They started kind of being, I don't know, changing. They started crying. They started admitting things. The story picked up in pace. The people were all kind of established, so we know who we were talking about. And things just therefore could speed up and get interesting. And that's when it got good. Really, really fantastic. If you have any interest in cowboy books, this is the one you should be reading. It's the best. Have I read any others? No. But there we go. So this is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, one of my recommendations on top of the best books I've ever read list. Okay, so here are all of the books in a pile, excluding the honorable mention ones because they aren't in this pile because they're not the best books I've read, but they are, but shut up. If you're looking for some book recommendations, this is where you should be looking. These are absolutely fantastic, all of them. Banging, incredible. You should be starting with these, depending on if you like some fantasy, maybe some Lord of the Rings, maybe some Brandon Sanderson. If you like murder mysteries written in the form of text and emails, crack on there. If you like a life story, have a look at Taylor Jenkins Reid or have a look at East of Eden. If you like moral stories, look at To Kill a Mockingbird. If you want to cry your bloody heart out, read One Day or The Heart's Invisible Furies. Amazing. All of these books are simply incredible. So this is probably my ultimate book recommendation list. There isn't like genre recommendations here, but I would probably recommend all of these. Let me know what your favourite books are of all time. Of course, comment below about whether you've read any of these, which ones were your favourite if you've read them as well, whether I've given you any book recommendations here. I'd absolutely adore to hear people say, Luke, I read such and such book because of you. I'm going to put these books down before they fall over. My back is killing me from sitting down because I don't like sitting like this, so this is probably the last one I'll do. But let me know if you enjoyed me sitting down or not. Either way, thank you for watching. If you've not yet liked and subscribed by now, I'm hoping to reach 500 by some point in July. I'm not sure I'm going to reach it, but if you haven't subscribed yet and you're looking at me and you've not subscribed, just bloody subscribe. Thank you. And goodbye.